simple one, but we often forget to do this. Okay? Well, it's to get reacquainted with your breath. Okay, so when we're in a situation in which we're chronically stressed, in terms of the way the brain works, right, you're no longer in a place where you can discern. You're in fight or flight or freeze mode. And so one of the ways that we can get back into the part of the brain that can think logically and discern is through breath work. Now, there are various different kinds of breath work that can be used. This one is taken from Navy SEALs who use it to regulate their heartbeat when they're on missions, and it's called box breathing. And it's a pretty simple tool. You basically would breathe in for 4 seconds. So if we can all do that. And you hold the breath for 4 seconds. And then we'll exhale for 4 seconds. And then we'll hold that for 4 seconds. And we repeat this cycle for about 2 minutes. So when you're in a situation in which you feel like you're triggered or you're stressed, the first tip that I've had to you is to breathe. Next slide, please. Okay. So once we've regulated our breathing, we're back in our bodies. We are less feeling triggered or less like we're in fight or flight response. The next tip that I would have for you is to check your fuel gauge or your fuel tank. Okay. And I have 3 here, but you might have more depending on what sphere you're thinking of, right? So you might have a fuel gauge for your work activities. You might have a fuel gauge for your home activities. You might have a fuel gauge for community or service-based activities. And so what I would encourage you to do is, let's say, take the next 7 days, right, and do an audit. Figure out what activities you are doing that give you energy, as well as the activities that deplete your energy. And you can gauge, right? Are you spending 50% or more of your time on things that deplete you, or are you spending 50% or more of your time on things that energize you? By taking a snapshot of this, you can begin to understand where your priorities lie, not just by what you think, right, you're focusing on, but what you're actually doing behaviorally. It provides you a baseline by which you can then assess, am I, of the time, the hours, the energy that I have, am I using it in the most productive, efficient, energizing way as possible? Next slide, please. This next tip is around accepting that it is okay to be in a situation where you are feeling maxed out and to normalize that. Okay? I think there's a lot of, in the past at least, when people say things like they are stressed or that they are burned out, there's sometimes a judgment that happens with that, for example, with peers or with direct reports or with superiors, that if other people are not in that situation, then people can just kind of suck it up, right? Suck it up and get it together. What I want to do here through this tip is to normalize the fact that everybody has a different threshold of tolerance for stress and for burnout, and to not judge yourself for this. So to work on getting rid of limiting beliefs around having to hold everything and be responsible for everything and everyone. So if we go to the next slide, there's a simple exercise that folks can do, and this is adapted from the work of the Institute for Coaching Mastery and some work at UC Santa Barbara around forgiving judgments, right? So for example, one limiting belief might be that I have to be all things to all people. So to Indranili's point earlier, I have to be a stellar top CEO, I have to be mom of the year, and I have to be a meaningful contributor to my community. I have to be all things to all people all the time. Okay. Rather than thinking through this limiting belief, you might forgive yourself for judging yourself for thinking that you have to be all things to all people, and acknowledging the truth, which is that you're doing the best that you can. So I have a few examples there if you want to take a look later. The fourth tip is around going back to your energy audit, right? So you've taken the time to assess where you've spent your time and your energy. And everybody has a different conception of where they think they want to operate from, right? So if you want to be, it might be at 80%, it might be at 90%, it might be at 100%, right? Depending on where you want your fuel gauge to be, this tip is around building in time in your calendar to do things that refuel you. So that might be spending time in nature, that might be doing exercise, that might be as simple as having a phone call with a friend that you haven't spoken to in a while. Right? But coming up with a list of things that refuel you and putting time in your calendar to do so, because if you don't schedule the time, that is the first thing that will be let go. We have to really be intentional about how we spend our time. And in order to ingrain these new practices of being, right, holding ourselves accountable, and one way of doing that is literally putting it. We can go to the next slide, please. So this is really around not necessarily systemic or institutional ways to prevent burnout, but individual things and practices that we can do to manage and master ourselves so that we can not get into a situation where we become chronically stressed or burned out. But this requires us to do new things, right? To think in new ways, to do things that we might not be used to doing, or to step into new ways of being. And that has its challenges if we were to do it on our own. And so the last tip that I wanted to share is around calling upon or building support structures. If you can go to the next slide, please. Support structures that can support you as you set clear boundaries around time and energy. Now, in the adaptive leadership framework, we talk about allies and confidants, or in authentic leadership, we talk about support teams, right? Who are the people that you can surround yourself with, who you can tap into, right? Who can help you to hold yourself accountable, and who you can also hold to account for the things that they want to accomplish or the ways in which they want to be. Anytime you're dealing with behavior change, right, it's much harder when you're going to try and institute it by yourself. It's like trying to quit smoking cold turkey without some sort of support network to hold you accountable when things might be challenging or when you might relapse. Okay. So these are the 5 tips. If you can just put the next slide up, it's just a summary of the different tips, which again happen at the individual level. Okay. I focus this around things that each of us can do at the individual level to try and step back and discern so that then we get more options for action as opposed to staying in a place where we feel stuck, where we feel like we can't grow, and where we feel like our energy is depleted and we become increasingly frustrated.